So yay. We're gonna go ahead and get started just because of time, and I'm really excited to be here. I'll introduce myself and then George can introduce himself, but we'll do some introductions for everyone. But for now, I'm Sarah Bailey. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm an assistant professor of counseling at the University of Lynchburg in Lynchburg, Virginia.
I'm George McCullough. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm a grad student at University of Lynchburg.
Yeah. So we're really glad you're here. And the topic is really focused on looking at developmental education in counselor education a little differently. So I've got a sort of a case example of how we did that this summer. So here are the learning objectives.
The first learning objective was to have engaging conversations about death at the beginning of the semester rather than at the end of the semester. The second learning objective was how first-person reflections help support engagement and considerations of later life. The third was to learn about Erickson's 9th developmental stage in class, and the fourth was online and face-to-face classroom interventions to help teach knowledge, awareness, and skills of helping people in later life. And so we wanted to ask you, what do you remember about your lifespan courses when you took them? Education.
So we've got some Post-its over there.
So just spend like a minute.
Yeah,
and,
just a minute. Yeah. Sorry.
Whatever you remember about it, write it down.
Don't edit, just throw it down. Word vomit on the Post-it. And I'll invite folks in the virtual audience to do so as well. Things you remember about your lifespan development course, graduate and undergraduate. Just throw some words on the Post-it.
I think it's the green one.
What are you trying to do?
Trying to see who else is here. I was going to engage.
Here, you can press present again. If you see down here, their videos will pop up there. So it looks like there's no one else in the meeting.
Okay, because I saw someone come up and they went away.
Yeah, if you're up here, participants, there's only one, so it's you.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Okay. 10 more seconds. 10. I know. It's okay. It's okay. Real life. This is real life here. Okay, we're gonna call it. We're gonna call it. I'll start with you. Introduce yourself to us and share what you've written or what you remember.
Yeah, my name is Allie Pongetti. I'm a grad student here at UNC Charlotte. And I wrote, most of mine was from undergrad, like a while ago. So there was a lot about like childhood that I remember, prenatal and preschool and all of that. And then I distinctly remember talking about the midlife crisis. That was interesting. And then there was a portion about theories of homosexuality and how that like occurs biologically, which I always stuck with me. And then there was like a bit about death that I do remember. Okay, but not a lot.
Okay. And tell me your name again.
Allie.
Allie, thank you. Julie.
So I would like to acknowledge that I think I had an abnormal experience multiple times. However, I do actually remember doing Death Cafe. That like really stands out to me. Talking about the Medicare coverage gap. And then I just co-taught a lifespan course this summer, and we made I don't know, we did this thing, but so much child development. There's just so much theory about child development.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Tony.
Yeah, I never took it as an undergrad.
Okay.
I was and then I wrote not much. I really don't remember anything as a grad student about the class, and so maybe I found some things to not be applicable to like what I wanted to do at that time. I was just having a conversation with Holly about this, but I think we spent a lot of time in like infancy and all that. It's like, oh gosh, like the next time I have a 6-month-old as a client.
Yeah.
So it's like it's good to have that as a resource on the shelf if you need it, but I didn't find it to be applicable. And now I teach it. It's more appropriate to what they're actually going to be using.
Yeah.
Okay, so for my personal experience, when I took lifespan development in undergrad, it was very brain focused, like you guys are talking about, very much on the development from infancy to like being a teenager. And there wasn't much else that I remember from that course. I remember it was taught by a grad student who just sort of read off the slides, the standard experience.
Oh, sorry.
And then for my grad education, I took it online asynchronously with COVID and everything like that. And I don't remember very much of anything from that course. And I took it like a few months ago. So we thought that was interesting in comparison to the course I took with her, because you get taught lifespan a few times if you go through your master's education, and it can be pretty easy to turn your brain off once you've taken the first one.
Now, for me, I went to UNC Chapel Hill for my undergrad. I graduated in '88, so decades ago. I remember nothing. When I did my master's at Wake Forest, though, I remember a lot, because we used something called My Virtual Child, which some of you may be familiar with. And I had already raised a child at that point. My husband and I had a child who was going to college. And so I did my virtual child with the same sorts of decisions that I made for our son. Instead, I used them for my virtual daughter. And my virtual daughter turned out exactly the same way as my actual son. Exactly. And during the time that I was taking lifespan, at the point that we got to the end of life, at the end of the semester, as chance would have it, my biological mother died very suddenly. And so I was in a deep, deep, dark season of grief as we got to death at the end of the semester. And I remember having to run out of the room. And I mean, literally ran out of the room. So that was my developmental experience.
And so traditional lifespan development, they'll start at the beginning and they go towards the end. And, they start with infancy and all the brain development and everything. And then they sort of go into midlife and all of that. And so there's a very heavy concentration, if any of you have ever taken these courses, in 0 through 18, and then they go towards midlife. And it's almost like it's a child development course a bit, is what it feels like when you're in there, because like half the semester is about that. And then they talk about developmental models and stuff like that.
And so to me, I question messaging. Like, I want to know about what are we teaching content, but I really want to know spirit and energetic and practical. Like, what are we teaching? So to me, messaging really matters when we're talking about counselor education. And when I think about development, lifespan development, I think about what rises to the top as being most important and what falls to the bottom as being least important. And as George and I have been conceptualizing this, my thought went to the mid-2000s when the food pyramid came out. Now, at the time, there was a lot of critique and criticism about it, and I don't want to get into the mechanics of it specifically around what foods are appropriate or not. But if you think about Maslow's hierarchy, and you think about where self-actualization is, where is it on that pyramid? All the way up, right? It's the most important thing. It's what we're ideally achieving. So you look at the food pyramid, and some of the critique about it was the thing at the top is a thing we should be avoiding. The Twinkies and the Ho-Hos are at the top. That's what we really like, and that's what it sounds like we're teaching. So some folks then decided to flip that literally on its head to try to emphasize the more wholesome plant-based foods. So where this idea about that in relation to counselor education lifespan courses was actually birthed at a presentation I was giving at the Southern Gerontological Society conference in Asheville. I think it was 2017. I was in the thick of my dissertation study, and I was coming up really, as those of us who are looking at midlife and beyond do, against a lot of challenges in finding solid literature. And one of my complaints had been with lifespan is that we put midlife and the rest of our life almost on the back burner. At least that's what I felt. That was my experience. And I figured I couldn't be the only one. In that session, one of the attendees was a professor, probably of sociology, because this is a gerontology conference, not counseling. And he said, oh, well, I did something interesting. I taught lifespan from death to birth. Oh, interesting. Well, I was a doc student at that time, I wasn't teaching developmental or lifespan. So I kind of put that in the back of my brain. I thought there's got to be a time when I can use this. So the idea then behind reverse chronology lifespan development is exactly that, starting at death, moving through sequentially to birth. And this is, kind of a strange concept, because how do we do this in a meaningful way that provides our students with what they need, captures their attention, keeps them engaged, and leaves them not only kind of matching what K-Crep tells us we need to have them leave with, but also leaves them with a curiosity about all life stages and how they're connected. So here's what we're looking at with reverse chronology lifespan development.
So obviously, like you're saying, beginning at the end, we start with death and then you end, with birth. And so the point of this, one of the pros of it, is that it's unexpected. And so your students come in, first thing you hit them with is death, and then you've got their attention, right? Think about the emotional bandwidth the student has as the semester goes on, right? Towards exams and all of that. It seems like you're going to have better conversations about that at the beginning rather than at the end, when everyone's worried about writing papers, exams, all of this other stuff that's taking up their brain space. So we think that getting death out of the way at the beginning, when they're energetic and they have had a break, allows for more meaningful conversations around that. And it really helps with time management, because you start with that and then you can sort of go your way down towards the infant and stuff like that. And so the cons, obviously, is that the early developmental is foundational and everything builds off of that, right? And then people may be disinterested unless it's a mandatory course you have to take. And, most of the time you mandatorily have to take a developmental course anyway. So another thing is that it might be tough to sell people on the fact that starting with death is a good idea. It sounds a little strange. And then how do you work in the developmental models is one of those questions people are going to ask.
Yeah. So I wanted to kind of review some of the developmental models that we talk about in a lot of different ways throughout counselor education. Of course, for Oried, yay, let's talk about our friend whose middle name, did you know? Anyone know his middle name? Sigmund Freud's middle name? Shlomo. Sigismund Shlomo Freud. The more you know. Yeah. So for psychosexual stages, of course, even if we sort of, haha about Freud, a lot of our profession, counseling psychology, is based on the notions of Freud and his Vienna school. Then we look at Piaget, again, starting from birth, moving through to 12 years, and then we kind of throw up our hands and go, okay, happy adulthood. And then Erik Erikson's 8 models of psychosocial development. And with Erikson's model, that last one, maturity, has always struck me because of its descriptor, despair. Ego integrity versus despair. Again, all of these suggest that there's a binary. And of course, there's not. We know there's not in practice. But these 8 stages have framed a lot of what we do in counselor education. So I have a question for you. And here's another Post-it note opportunity. I'm going to give you a minute to write down on your Post-it what you remember about Erikson's 9th stage of development.
Is that the last one?
The 9th stage. So this one, 8 stages. What about the 9th stage? This is a test. This is a test. 9th stage. I'm expecting great things from you, Tony, your counselor educator friend. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So. Julie just had a 0 on her head for those of you who may be watching this recorded. Yeah, Tony.
What's your question?
Okay.
I don't know the 9th stage.
Yeah.
I said nothing.
Nothing. Yeah. Okay. So let me introduce you. Anyone know who this is? It may say that on that.
Joan
Yeah,
Erickson.
Joan. This is Erik Erikson's wife. who in their later marriage together collaborated a good bit. And hopefully we can get this to play. We'll get the volume up, hopefully, we'll see. This is as loud as it's gonna get, that's okay. You can't hear this. Okay, so if we can make this play, that's great. And if we can't, that's okay too. Oh yeah. Okay, I'm gonna stop this and go back because if we've got the closed captioning, I want you to see the captions.
Yeah, and then you can at least get an idea of what she's saying.
Yeah, here we go. Nope, I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
I know, it'll be okay. Isn't it nice to just be with people who are forgiving? Let's see if we've got her. It's lovely music, lovely elevator music. Imagine. For heaven's sake. Closed captioning is always so accurate. Pause this for a second. Use the good old trusty vote because we're not getting.
Brush your teeth in less than 10 seconds with
That's
this
not it.
revolutionary toothbrush.
Hold on. I'm shocked. Here we go.
She's just talking right there, so it doesn't really matter.
Now you can hear loving music. This is important because I want you to hear her words.
I feel very strongly about talking about it first about aging. The psychology to people who depended on the fact that when they get wise, integrate this will be gorgeous. And it isn't at all, you know. I feel as if we all went to college. That wasn't it. We hadn't been there, so we didn't know.
We hadn't been there, so we didn't know the difference.
you certainly don't have that smooth. It comes a moment when you face the fact that both you and your husband are in the 90s, you suddenly think, well, how is it big? And how is it going to be? What more is there coming? Because you can't expect it a long time after. I think the thing that I feel responsible for is when I discovered that as I looked at the stages of the students, I realized all of a sudden that decided was the final stage, the end stage, that was not necessarily right. It's just plain wrong.
So rethinking the 8th stage of wisdom.
You feel like the emperor, story about it, and everything goes on and on, but you face reality. Look back to yourself. And that means that you're away. It's about everything else. You should enjoy it. You should find yourself.
You can get the general gist of this. And I would love for you, if you're interested, seek this out. This is part 1 of 2. Both are very short videos, but Joan Erickson and her husband, Eric, as he was dying, were coming to this place of understanding that the 8 stages weren't enough. They had crafted this 8 stage model with the understanding that they had. And so for most of us, in fact, I would say for everyone in this room, I don't know if we can get rid of that piece or not. The 9th stage is really news to us. I don't remember being taught the 9th stage. And sometimes it's described as gerotranscendence, which is kind of a lofty term, but the notion is that through the cycle of life, we weave our experiences together. And as we weave and weave and weave, the patterns may change, but the loom is the same. And I'm not a weaver and I don't know the terminology, but the notion that the frame is there and those verticals are there and what we weave within those threads is our life. And as we age, including if you are Eric Erickson and Joan Erickson, the way we see the world changes as well. And so as counselors, to be flexible in our own understanding of development, I think is key. And this model, this 9th stage of the model, at least, really emphasizes the fact, and I believe this wholeheartedly, development is lifelong. If there is breath, there is development. If there's no breath, that is death. But development continues throughout the lifespan. So, thank you. I come to our course. So this summer, back in the spring, or actually back last fall, I started thinking about, I've been wanting to teach a course devoted to midlife and beyond since I got to Lynchburg a couple of years ago, and we have 3 required electives. And so electives can be special topics courses, or they can be courses in different departments. And so I offered a special topics option that I called Considerations of Later Life for Helping Professionals, Developmental Approach. And my hope was that counseling students and other students from other departments would come. We did only have counseling students, which was great. But I wanted to kind of go through some of the course highlights, because in this way, I finally had the chance to do what I was thinking about doing in terms of flipping lifespan. But I don't teach lifespan, but in this case, I did sort of half of lifespan. So you mentioned earlier, Julie, Death Cafe. Now, the idea behind Death Cafe is a non-hierarchical, collaborative conversation about death that is typically held either in an actual cafe setting or with refreshment. So we could have a Death Cafe here. I might bring some coffee and some tea and some pastries and a donut or two, and we sit around and we talk about death. Now, the challenge with death, of course, is that for us as humans, and I'm a big believer in terror management theory. If you don't know a lot about it, go in there, dig around, it was good stuff. But our primal fear of death is innate. We, from an early age, recognize that our lifespan is finite. So talking about death is not necessarily, in fact, it's very infrequently easy for anyone. So what I did for our course, again, I'm the instructor and my students are my students. There is that hierarchy, so I acknowledge that, and that is present. But I adapted Death Cafe and created prompts that I used in the classroom. These are some examples of the prompts that I used to spark conversation. And the idea again about Death Cafe is it is not facilitated as much as it is supported. So yes, I was the facilitator. So again, I want to emphasize that difference. This was not a classic Death Cafe, but I modeled what we did in class on this. Let me go back. George, I'll let you kind of describe your experience with it.
Well, so when we did the Death Cafe, she didn't even describe it as a Death Cafe. It was just a conversation about that. So I never even heard this term until she did the presentation. But our course was she allowed people to come in person or we could be on the computer. And so I thought that was really unique because since the conversation about death is so difficult sometimes, and a lot of us have very personal experiences around death, if you wanted to stay at home and then be on the computer so that if you're talking about something and you need to step away, you just turn off the camera, right? And then you don't have to walk out of the room and make a scene and do all of these things. So I thought that was very important to how we had a good conversation during the Death Cafe, because you could sort of unplug if you needed to, right? And then the people who really benefited from being in person also got that. And I thought the prompts really offered up a push, like a shove in a certain direction to talk about certain things. Like we may not have talked about legacy if she had not brought it up in a prompt, or what a good death is if it wasn't something we had been shown and asked to talk about.
And I was surprised at the content of the responses to the prompts. I wasn't surprised about the quality of the responses. That I fully expected my students to be engaged and thoughtful, and everyone was. What George is describing, though, was unintentional. This was set as an online course, and then the COVID rules changed. And I wanted to offer the option of meeting a couple of times face-to-face. So that was not my intention, but it ended up working well for some students. And I told my students, you can come face-to-face or you can stay at home. You don't need to tell me why or how. You make that choice for yourself. But an unintended advantage of that for students was the option to stay at home. So other parts of the course, I invited students to do decades reflections, but in reverse. So using first person language, and I was really specific around this. I didn't want you to describe, when I'm in my 90s, I will. I wanted you to describe as if today I am in my 90s, and then to describe what's going on in your life with these prompts, daily schedule, relationships, etc. And these were done, we did the whole course in Google Classroom, and these were done as questions, which in Google Classroom on that platform, these are visible to everyone. So there was some emotional exposure there potentially for students in sharing what they imagine themselves to be like when they were in their different decades. We did start with 90s and work our way back. Yesterday, George and I were talking about the presentation, and we came upon something kind of interesting.
Yeah, so we were realizing, when you do the virtual child, they'll hit you with an event, right? It'll be like, oh, your wife lost their job or something, your partner lost their job, what are you going to do? And we came to the realization that old age is also like that, it's not like you're going to retire and then you're going to plateau and then everything's going to be the same and you're just going to go golfing and do all your hobbies and everything's going to be normal and great. You could end up having to take care of a grandchild, you could fall and break your hip, you could do all these things. So what we came up with is that the prompts, right? But with a twist, you lost your job when you were 60, or your retirement got put on hold because of medical bills, or your partner has gotten sick. What do you do? How does that affect you when you're 70, 80 years old? And really getting them to like dig deep into those situations that a lot of these elderly people are in.
Because what George and I were talking about, and I asked him yesterday, because again, he's my student and I understand the relationship even now. If I wasn't standing here, it's likely he might be saying something very different, and I want to honor that. But I asked him to share any feedback that he felt hopefully safe enough to share. And the feedback you did share, which I really value a lot, is these reflections could become redundant for a student, you know, who again is just imagining themselves. So peppering randomly students with these sorts of challenges. So not every student will get the same challenge, and inviting them to incorporate that into the prompt makes a lot of sense. And it does line up with that virtual child platform. So I love that idea. And hopefully when I get to teach this again, I'm going to integrate that. So I really value that. So again, this was that inadvertent hybridization, but I'd love for you to talk about the live cam.
Okay, so I actually stayed at home for all of these that they did in person. And so the interesting part about that was, well, we had some issues with, you know, like the computer, we couldn't hear and whatever. So she ended up switching it to her phone. And it really, I would recommend that if you ever have that sort of hybrid situation to teach and then carry them around on the phone so they feel involved. Because it was very, it was like watching a TV show or something that featured my classmates, and we were able to have a discussion and I felt included.
So my student, and I wasn't holding the phone most of the time, I would offer to a student. And so if you were talking, they'd bring the phone over to you.
Yeah.
And you know, it was kind of silly and goofy, but
it created a very interactive experience for the people who stayed at home. And it sort of integrated them into the classroom space for the people who were there, you know, and I thought that was really important and helped with the discussions, because then it was like, oh, I'm like, you know, they're holding me on the phone. It's like you're FaceTiming them or something, instead of sitting in the corner of the room somewhere with this big broadcast view camera.
And again, that was inadvertent. So those kinds of things can sometimes work out really well. Another thing that I included, I want to make sure we're good. Yeah, we're going to time. Another thing I wanted to include were some assessments just to measure change. And I've used 3. I used the Faboni scale of ageism, which I've used before in other research, and the anxiety about aging scale. I've used both of those in previous projects. I also incorporated the Arabic scale of death anxiety, which I have linked in the presentation so you can get access to that. But that is a really, I don't even know how to articulate it. I invite you to look into it. I really like the language in that particular scale. And so I've linked some resources to those. But at the beginning of the semester, I offered these 3 in, you can see literally what these assessments looked like. Everyone took them either in person or through Google Forms at the beginning of the semester and at the end of the semester. Now, George and I were talking about this earlier, and he said, oh, you never talked about that. Well, here's what I'm going to say about that. I did not get an IRB for any research for this class. I also did not get written or verbal permission from my students to share any changes in these scales. So I'm not going to report changes in the scales. My intention, George, just for your knowledge, my intention is to go back in. I've looked, I kind of know what happened, but I really want to go back and kind of parse some things out and then share them with students. So that's how that information will be used. Hopefully, if I teach this again, though, I will seek IRB approval and really integrate this into hopefully something that can be a collaborative research study with my students. But it was nice to give students an opportunity to take an assessment and also to kind of ask themselves
Yeah, I
how
think it was
things.
a good primer, because you gave it to us at the very beginning of the course, you know, and then it gets your brain going on these thoughts of ageism and all of that before she even talks about it.
Yeah. And so I always come back to this because I feel like when we are talking about any counselor education, coursework, andragogy, assessment standards, we really need to go back to Sue et al.'s 1992 tripartite model. Because what we're talking about here with midlife and beyond, and I'm defining midlife chronologically as if we live to 100, which we know that is not necessarily the case. Had a presentation yesterday where I'm still struggling on what language to use. But the notion that to flip a classroom, whether you are flipping a developmental classroom, a lifespan development classroom chronologically, or you're flipping and you're making something hybrid, or you're making something online, asynchronous, whatever, is to kind of go back to that three-legged stool. Are we teaching the concepts and the content that students need to know to have the capacity to go out and do the work? And we know that's a very small part, but we also know that if we're K-CREP accredited, and the University of Lynchburg is, that we need to abide by the standards set by that accreditation body. So are the knowledge points being checked? So in a flipped lifespan development classroom, yes, you can check all the boxes. You may be faced at the end of the semester, like you are in a traditional semester, or even the end of a summer course, with the lack of enthusiasm, the energy, the exhaustion, the life stuff that can make it challenging. So if you can imagine then, if you take a full lifespan course, completely flip it, and you put birth, infancy, young adolescence at the end of the semester, are you shortchanging the content knowledge? I don't know. Tony, you teach lifespan.
I can see that, and especially in our program, we don't have a separate class on the child and adolescent development or even child and adolescent counseling. That there might be some students who just get frustrated by that, like, oh, child and adolescents are my area of interest, population I work with professionally, and I don't get much exposure to that. But yeah, but then I'm saying that, then I realize there's also some students who have the same opposite approach. Like, I want to work with an older population. We never talk about it anywhere.
Right.
So yeah, so I'm not sure the answer. But,
Yeah. Julie, what do you think?
I guess I'm so excited. I think, obviously, I don't know, but I think that the answer is no. And it's, my brain is exploding with excitement about this. And so one, I think we still have the actual flipped classroom asynchronous work.
Mhm.
Like a lot, I didn't take a development course in my undergrad. I would say the majority of my cohort members in my master's and now in my doctoral program have.
Mhm.
And they don't, it's much more early. And so they have more experience with that a lot of the time. So I think it makes sense to me for that to be a little bit more, okay, we're gonna have some async, maybe heavier on some of the review reading and bring that to class for discussion and an intimate conversation like that. To me, it's different. But I'm excited that you're going to probably pursue like an IRB so you can look at this more closely, because I think that it could really expand and shift the way that we start with later life and death, moving to childhood. I think it could expand the way that we even perceive the earlier stages.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just excited.
We have that connection, because I feel you. One thing that I didn't say earlier about the reflections, the decades reflections, one thing that came through very clearly, and it was a prompt, was things you wish you had done differently when you were younger. Because truly, in full transparency, part of my desire to teach this class wasn't just because I wanted to teach the class. It's also because I feel like part of my job as a counselor educator is to help students who are younger than I am now. So that's under 54, almost 55. Anyone younger than me, I want them, and me too, all of us, to think about what we can do now to plan for our later life. And a lot of the reflections included things like, I wish I had paid closer attention to my nutrition when I was younger. Or I am glad I stayed in contact with my friend group when I was younger. So conceptualizing how a later stage in life could look based on decisions made today, I think has a lot of value. And something you just said, Julie, made me think, because COVID has taught us a lot of things. One, that we can be flexible, right? We can do online, we can do face-to-face, we can do a mix of both. Maybe almost a flipped meeting in the middle. So maybe part of it can be synchronous, starting at the end or the beginning of life. Maybe we can do the opposite asynchronously or synchronously. I think there's a lot of potential here. And I don't want to get too far out in the weeds. But what I want to leave you with is the notion that maybe we can be more flexible than we've been trained to be when it comes to lifespan. Now, skills with counseling folks at different ages, there are, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, there's not this magical moment in life where as a human being, you need different things. Like you don't wake up one day, oh, I need my counseling to be another way now. There are some considerations that occur as we get older, that things like hearing loss, that's pretty ubiquitous as we get older. It's not everyone, but pretty much the vast majority of folks will have some hearing loss. But all of us have communication difficulties now and again with masks, with loud noise. There are always some challenges. So maybe we can translate some of the gero-focused skills that some of us may be aware of into just skills. Communicating clearly, speaking intentionally, looking people in the eyes, slowing down. Those help all of us understand, not just those of us with hearing differences or hearing losses. So I think there are ways to depathologize and de-gerontologize some of the things that are important in ways that we can blend into lifespan as well. And then awareness. And a lot of what happened, I feel like at least happened this summer course, was around student awareness. And I remember when we started the death conversation, that first class, at least 2 students said very upfront, I am not comfortable talking about death. I am not feeling really good about this right now. And I went into that class really nervous because I knew that I had some students remote and some students in person. I'm like, I want to make sure I can manage this well. I was so impressed with just the engagement and the courage folks invested in that process, in person and distance. So these were the learning objectives. And now, what do you all know about Erickson's 9th developmental stage? Yes, you do know a little bit. You know where to get access to that information. There are a lot of different ways that we can approach a reverse chronology lifespan course. Maybe it is in pieces instead of a full semester course. I was telling George last night, I am not interested personally right now in teaching a complete reverse chronology course because I don't teach lifespan right now. But I would challenge all of us when we're integrating those developmental stages into our coursework to think about flipping. Here are our references. Here is a QR code. And this QR code will take you to a document with the references on it and with our email information. So if you want to continue the conversation, if you want to check in, if you want to collaborate, if you want to talk about course development or syllabi, that sort of thing, love to keep that conversation going. Let me know if that does not work for you. I feel like it should. Well, and another thing that kind of is bubbling up for me, I'm thinking about this holistically, is think about a trauma approach to pedagogy and andragogy. It's actually andragogy in counselor education. Where does trauma often happen? In those early years. And you, throughout your whole lifespan, could be impacted by that trauma. So if we start with death, and we had 2 students, and it was their first class this summer. So that was the first thing. Like, hi, welcome. Let's talk about your death. To reflect back, to plan ahead and reflect back, emphasizes the importance of early childhood development and recognition of trauma and prevention of trauma and addressing trauma early rather than later. Because so many of the difficulties we have as we mature are based on those earlier traumatic experiences that don't have a light of day. So it's easier, I think, to argue that this is what it can look like when you're deaf, unresolved trauma, versus just talking about the trauma as it's happening in younger childhood. So another kind of thing that has bubbled up for me is development. And we are done with time. Thank you all so much for being here. And please reach out. I'd love to stay in contact and learn together and grow together, because this is just a conversation. Looking in the research, there is none. We found 2 pieces. One was in ophthalmology. The other was in art, of reversing chronology kind of in pedagogy and andragogy. So there's some space here, y'all, if we want to do some work. There's opportunity.